Well, hi. Hello. Hello. This is to use a Latin term, this is the coveted postprandial talk. What's that? It's the after lunch talk. So, I want to talk about flake news. Why are we hearing that phrase, fake news, all of a sudden? Why is that happening so much? Why is this a thing now? I have water, I have a microphone. I'm good for a couple of hours. So, let's talk about fake news, flake news, real news, news and media. During the last presidential campaign, there were various stories that were circulating on the internet, made up out of whole cloth, just somebody cooked them up, and some of which were not flattering to Hillary. In the aftermath of the election, when her people were flailing around in search of someone or something to blame, the smartest woman in the history of the world lost to him. That was a trouble. So they were looking around for someone or something to blame, someone to blame besides Her Majesty. And so one of the ideas that they tried out was the idea that it was fake news. They used that phrase, fake news, that had hurt her in the final days of the election. So let's run that one up the flagpole and see if anybody salutes. Not only did no one salute, but something else entirely happened. It just ricocheted in an odd direction. Now, before proceeding further, I'm operating, much of what I'm doing here is analysis of what's going on out there. I'm not trying to operate as a cheerleader for any particular faction out there. I'm simply trying to describe for you what's going on and describe it in such a way that will help you as you're being bombarded with all sorts of news reports on the internet and on streaming television and on your cable news. There's this torrent of information. How do I sort this out? How do I think like a Christian when all these people are telling me stuff? So I want to acknowledge fully and sincerely that there were stories out there about Hillary that, when it came to the falsitudinous quotient, it ranked pretty high. They were pretty false, pretty wrong. There were things that were made up about her. I also acknowledge that Nigerian princes who are stranded in Manila with a suitcase full of gold bullion are also not, as we might say, legit. Do not send them your bank account number. This is a pro tip for the future. When stranded Nigerian princes with extra gold that they want to give away, and I've seen multiple emails of that kind of thing. Pro tip, don't believe them. It's all wrong. And you might sit back in your chair, not only do not send them your bank account number, but sit back in your chair and wonder, they're doing this because somebody is sending their bank account number. Who believes this stuff? Don't do it. And further, I cheerfully note that purveyors of clickbait techniques love to tell us that what Ted Cruz said next went boom, and that Kellyanne Conway destroyed Anderson Cooper, and that when you see what Bo Derek looks like now, it will blow your mind. So don't be a clickbait junkie. You know, there are lots of rabbit holes, and you don't want to click on any rabbit. Clickbait there's a certain tell which you should be able to identify after the first one or two rabbit holes. Don't go down those rabbit holes anymore. So Hillary had to deal with that kind of foolishness, that level of foolishness, as well as all the rest of us. So welcome to Earth, kid. Good grief. That's the way it is. And I want to throw in another qualification. Donald Trump is a wrecking ball. It's possible to applaud the fact of some of the wreckage without applauding, you might say, the entire project. Remember that Elisha met privately with Hazael, but he was not in cahoots with Hazael. Elisha sent a young prophet to anoint Jehu king, but was not part of Jehu's faction. I look at Donald Trump calling CNN names in a presidential news conference, and I realize yet again that God loves us and wants us to be happy. But you can have that reaction without becoming a cheerleader for any one particular faction. What you want to do as a Christian is maintain distance, maintain emotional distance. Don't get sucked up in the wahooing. Just what's going on? What are they saying? And this is something that, incidentally, the two basic questions you ought to be asking, whether you're reading a book or watching a movie or watching a sitcom or YouTube videos or a presidential debate or you're reading a news article. What are they saying, and is it true? What are they saying? What is the claim that is being made? Or what is the claim that is being quietly assumed? And is that claim accurate? Is that claim true? So, let's get back to the thread. Hillary lost this campaign that she should have won, right? It was astonishing to pretty much everybody, including Donald Trump, that he won. And so she was looking for someone to find fault with, and one of the things she landed on was this thing called fake news. And this is what happened. The whole thing, as soon as she tried to use it, the whole thing twisted on her. Fake news became an item of concern as the Hillary folks were trying to explain how the most qualified woman in the world managed to lose to Donald Jehu Trump. They put the phrase fake news out there into play, but they tried doing so by means of an onside kick. The ball flew like a wounded duck, landed on the pointy end, and bounced in ways that would require a sports writer of the old school to describe. Trump picked it up, but instead of running for the end zone, he ran down the offensive line of the Democratic Party, knocking over CNN, CBS, MSNBC, two refs, and the water boy. Okay, let's be frank with each other, you and I. Sometimes when the metaphor mojo is running a little hot, there really isn't really anything you can do except start a new section and hope the pistons didn't melt. So, fake news. I'm back on topic now. At any rate, the phrase fake news was used by Hillary to refer the molehill of Facebook stories that described her as an illegal immigrant from Area 51. Enough laughs to know that some of you know what that is, right? So, and here we are, a year and a half after the election, and there's a Russian collusion investigation that's still going on because of this allegation of fake news. And then Trump picked the phrase up, and he used it to refer to the Himalayas of bum dope that had been churned out by the metric ton for decades by the news media, by what we now call the mainstream media. He used it of them and on them, and the dang thing stuck. All right, so what happened was the phrase was coined by Hillary to blame the little molehills on Facebook, and Trump just picked it up and threw it back, and it didn't stick to him. It didn't stick to the little weird groups that were circulating admittedly false stories, and it did stick to what's called the mainstream media. He used it of them and on them, and it stuck. He refused to allow CNN to question him in a press conference because, and he pointed at them, "You are fake news." You are fake. No, I'm not going to call on you. You are fake news. And in one presser, he said, "No, that isn't quite right. You are very fake news." So Hillary tried to call flake news by the name fake news, and it got turned around and applied to a more worthy object, and it came home and rested on the mainstream media instead of the little alternative-y outlets. Okay? Now, ordinarily, this fake news taunt would be just an insult, And if Mark Twain is to be believed, an ill-advised one. Mark Twain said, never pick a fight with people who buy ink by the barrel. Right? If you pick a fight with people who buy ink by the barrel, they can reply and they answer, you make your accusation to 10 people, and they reply to you and they make their reply to 10 million people. But this was not an ordinary circumstance, and I want to suggest to you in just a moment the reason why it's not an ordinary circumstance, and I want to help you get a chronological map in your heads that has an X on it that says you are here. Okay? This is not an ordinary circumstance. You do not live in ordinary times. You do not live in ordinary times. I honestly don't know if the newsprint, broadcast, and cable establishment is going to be able to recover from this, and this is why. All right, if you have let me just set the stage for you. George Washington, the father of our country, traveled around in pretty much the same way that Julius Caesar did. Okay, Julius Caesar and George Washington, when they wanted to go somewhere, had to go somewhere by sail or by horse. Either a horse-drawn means of locomotion or by sail. And you could have, in the first century, you could have mail delivered in the Mediterranean within just a few days. Okay, because they had the sail and the road, they had the thing down. So George Washington didn't live that long ago. Our problem is that we measure our lives like fruit flies would. We just measure in terms of our own lived experience, our own lifespan. But think about it this way. I read an interview, this was probably 10, 20 years ago, but I read an interview with a businessman, elderly businessman. He was probably in his late 50s, early 60s at the time, and he's still alive. So he's in his 70s or 80s now. And his odd circumstance was that he was conceived when his father was in his 80s. Okay, with me? He was conceived when his father was in his 80s. And the odd thing about it is that his father was also conceived when his father was in his 80s. So John Tyler, his father conceived him when he was in his 80s, and the same thing happened to his dad. And the grandfather was President Tyler of the United States, whose administration was prior to the Civil War. Okay, and John Tyler, the businessman living today, in this interview, he said he had a good time one time. He was flying across the Pacific in a jet airliner, and he was able to say to the seatmate next to him, yes, as my grandfather once said to his good friend, Patrick Henry. You say, wasn't that long ago, was it? So are there people in your town who are 100 years old? Yeah. So when were they born? 1918. Now, when they were born, and when they were a little baby, could you have taken them to someone who was alive in their town at that time and put this little baby on that person's lap who was also 100 years old? Yeah, that's easy to do. When were they born? 1818. Could you do it a third time? Yes, when were they born? 1718. 3 lifetimes, and you're back before the American Revolution, before George Washington. George Washington wasn't that long ago, in other words. Okay? George Washington wasn't that long ago. My mom was born in 1919. She was 10 years old when the first telephone was installed in the White House. Landline telephone. And this is the weird spot that you're in. If I take those 100-year-old increments, 3 lifetimes take us back earlier than America. 10 lifetimes takes you back to William the Conqueror. 20 of them like that takes you back to the time of Jesus. So So 20 lifetimes, end to end, 100 years old. Now, in the time of Jesus, or at the time of Julius Caesar, the most powerful emperor in the world had to travel around by horse-drawn chariot or horse-drawn wagon or on horseback or by sail. And George Washington had to do the same thing. What happened shortly after Washington in the 19th century, in the 1800s, what happened is called the Industrial Revolution, which you have no doubt studied in school, the Industrial Revolution. So that explodes, starts to take off in the early half of the 1800s. Some of the preconditions were earlier, but it really came online in the early part of the 1800s. I was born in 1953, and I grew up right near the high water mark of the Industrial Revolution. And when I was a young man, married with young kids, what you might call the Digital Revolution, which is as big or bigger than the Industrial Revolution, took off. Let's just mark that in the 1980s. Personal computing. If you've ever seen a photo of Houston Control during the moon landing in the 1960s, there are all these engineers sitting there with slide rules, right? You have more computing power in your smartphone than we had in the moon launch in the 1960s. Okay, so there's been an astonishing transformation. So agrarian, simple, straightforward, low-tech civilization, Industrial Revolution, which maybe runs for a century and a half, let's say a century and a half, 2 centuries, and you are living at the very threshold of the Digital Revolution, okay? And that has done something to news and media. That's done something to news and media, and that's what I want to talk to you about preparing for. So, what was the logic of the Industrial Revolution? What was the logic of the Industrial Revolution? Well, it was a centralizing logic. It was a centralizing logic. Farmers out in the sticks were squeezed off their land or left it voluntarily and went into the big city to get jobs at the manufacturing plants, at the factories. So the rich factory owners would build this big factory, and then people would congregate, and they would congregate in order to work in these factories. And the modern city was born. If you consider, one of the things that's really interesting about, George Whitefield preached in New York City, or near New York City. When George Whitefield preached in the 1700s, prior to the American Revolution, the cities he would go to, Philadelphia, New York, were important cities. But they were about the size, a little bit bigger, maybe twice as big as Moscow. If you read the history of the Reformation and you read about important centers like Geneva or Heidelberg, it would be cities with like 50,000 people in them. Moscow has 20,000 people. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, we started to see mega cities, the metropolis, millions of people. And this is because the means of production, the factory, were started to centralize in certain places, and people would flock there in order to get a better job, and they would work there. And so the logic of the Industrial Revolution was all a centralizing logic. The big city was born. The big state, the overweening state was born. It's all a centralizing logic. The capstone of that revolution, Industrial Revolution, when it comes to news and media, was the newsprint media established in the major cities in the 19th century and the broadcast media in the 20th century. So newsprint newspapers in the 19th century and then the broadcast media in the 20th century. In the 1980s, CNN arrived as a Johnny-come-lately on cable, making one think of an episode like the United States colonizing the Philippines. 2 centuries late and very self-important. So when I was a boy, C.S. Lewis begins an address somewhere. When you invite a middle-aged moralist to come speak to you, I can only conclude that you have a taste for middle-aged moralizing. So we're at that point. If you invite a geezer to address a crowd of young people, at some point he's going to say, "When I was a boy." So when I was a boy, you got your news. You got your news, if you got it at all, from the newspaper or from one of the big three broadcast stations, CBS, NBC, or ABC. So when I was a boy, the television was, when there was one, in our house we didn't have a television until I was in junior high school. When there was a television, and occasionally there was this rare thing called a color television set that rich people had. So it was in color. Normal, regular people had black and white televisions, and lots of people didn't have televisions. And when there was a television, you would walk over and you would turn it on by going click. That was one knob. Then there was a second knob. This was the early days of high tech. There was a second knob that you would go click, click, click. ABC, CBS, NBC. Those were your three. And if you were near a big city, you might have a fourth local station, something like that. So one click to turn on and off, and there was a remote. Are you kidding me? What's this thing as a remote? Get off your butt. Go change the channel yourself. Now, you had three options as compared to what you have, right? You have 150 stations and nothing on. We had three networks. If they blew sunshine at you, which they frequently did, there was not really much you could do about it. CBS, ABC, NBC were all part of the same little close network of people, and if they decided to tell you a particular story a particular way, that's the way it was. And the newspapers were generally in cahoots as well. There was not much you could do about it. In most cases, you wouldn't even know. In most cases, you wouldn't even know. There was no real way to cross-check anything. There was no real way to cross-check anything. What we ingested at that time was mass media, all right, with the collation done by people in the boardrooms there. Mass media. It was delivered in bulk. To readapt an image from a colorful writer of another era, stories went into the massive news factories on the hoof and came out in cans. The gatekeepers were quite diligent, and there were very few gates to guard. They were very diligent, they were very industrious, there were just a handful of gates to guard, and they guarded them fiercely. If your news source of choice was broadcast television, you had basically three flavors to choose from. The cans were all the same size and had basically the same gelatinous content. If somebody was lied about or misrepresented, or the story that involved them was significantly garbled, there was no practical recourse for that person. No practical recourse. And the fact that there was no recourse meant that there was no real disincentive for the media to avoid doing it. To be sure, there was that pesky concept called journalistic ethics that were supposed to govern the whole operation. But because there was very little practical recourse for the victim of a bad story, this meant that journalistic ethics had no one providing any police protection, and they lived on the bad side of town. So if I could insert my own testimony here, as one who has been written about in newspapers and magazines quite a bit, it is safe to say that it is usually the case that some significant fact or facts has been gotten wrong, particularly if the story involves some controversy. Okay? And I would say over 50%. So I've I've been on the scene in many controversies in many different situations that later got written up in the paper, or that later was written about, or had some news, some television thing done about it. And it's usually the case that some significant aspect of it is wrong. In other words, usually wrong, frequently unreliable. Usually wrong, frequently unreliable. And in this regard, there's been no appreciable difference with Christian media. Magazines like World, for example, have done a much poorer job with us than the New York Times has done. New St. Andrews had an article done by the New York Times, which is a liberal, a liberal newspaper, but this person came out, interviewed a bunch of people, wrote up a story, and then we got the different people who were mentioned in the story got a phone call from someone at the New York Times whose job was fact-checking. So I got a phone call. Were you, I don't remember the exact questions, but were you born at this time? Is this accurate? Is this accurate? Is this accurate? Any factual claim that was made about me was checked, right? And that, oftentimes Christian media, Christian magazines don't do that because that's an extra person to pay, right? That's an extra person that has to go on the salary, and where's the payoff from it? So I would say in that regard, to the New York Times, well done. Now, this is not to say that the New York Times doesn't have its issues. You get it? Issues? Now, what this has done, with the fact that everything was a basic handful of big city newspapers, 3 major news networks, and this was sort of the establishment for well over a century, right? The print media, the newspapers and the magazines bleeding over into the 20th century where you had the broadcast media. What that did over the course of decades, and the fact that people on the ground who were misrepresented or misquoted or misconstrued or missed something, a high level of frustration built up over time. Okay, like a volcano preparing to go. Not quite coast to coast, but close. This has been recognized for a long time, and politicians on the right, conservative politicians or politicians who want to be known as conservatives, have angled for cheap points by attacking the media during campaigns. Whereas if you want your poll numbers to go up, attack the newspapers. It's fun and it gets you popularity. Yay, right? But everything stayed just the same after elections as before, and the frustration continued to build. What Trump did is he attacked a venerable institution that was already wasting away. Right? He attacked a venerable institution that is already wasting away. In other words, Trump was the first big game dinosaur hunter. He's a dinosaur hunter. Now he's dinosaur hunting with shoulder-mounted RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and he's shooting at them from a rented safari jeep. So he's not really a mountain man. It's safe for him to do this because he's attacking something that has 150 years of pent-up frustration behind it. Okay? Now, another phrase you may have heard is the alt-right. And I think the alt-right, like fake news, is a distraction. The real issue for you is alt-media. The real issue for you is alt-media, not the alt-right, not the alt-left, just where are you going to get your news? So the significant change that has occurred is that it has become possible to stay reasonably well informed without coming into contact with any of the establishment media. Okay? You can now stay current without coming into contact with any of the big 3 networks or with any of the big newspapers because they're dinosaurs and they are fading away. A lot of people have taken the bypass, and they don't drive through downtown big media at all anymore. I haven't read a newspaper regularly for over a decade, and it's probably pushing 2 decades now. Why would I subscribe to this? It's dated. By the time you get it, it's dated. I can stay current right now by on my pad or my computer or my phone. I don't read newspapers anymore. I would have to work to find out where the big 3 networks are located on my television. I don't even know where they are anymore, right? I don't watch them. I don't pay attention to them. I don't have any contact with them. And yet, when I was a kid, that's, if you wanted to be connected at all, that was your point of connection. So I have no idea where the big 3 are hiding these days. I usually find out about breaking news through Twitter, Facebook, or various websites. Those websites are collated for me by me. I can say, who do I follow? What institutions do I follow? And I can, just like you're walking through a smorgasbord at a restaurant, you say, and you're making yourself a salad, you say, let's go heavy on the garbanzo beans. I love garbanzo beans. Let's do this with the cheese. Let's do that. You're walking, you have a media smorgasbord where it's possible for you to do dumb things with that also, right? You could walk through the smorgasbord and just load up on the Jell-O at the end, and that's all you have, and that's not a smart thing to do. Just because the big 3 were lying to you doesn't mean that you can't lie to yourself, right? So when you're picking or collating news sites, and you should, let me make a brief parenthetical comment. Twitter was not given to you by God. So you might say, my parents haven't given me Twitter at all. I don't have a smartphone at all. Well, good for them. But let's say you have a smartphone. Let's say God did not give you this amazing technology so that you could tell your cousin in Singapore what you had for lunch. Okay? Now, it's not a sin to tell them what you had for lunch, but isn't that kind of verbal, textual, digital scribbling? And then I got up and I went to the fridge and look what was in the fridge. And then I took it out to the table and look where I put it on the table. What's wrong with you? I mean, there are more substantive things that you can do with all this. So you might have trouble. For example, let's say you take a picture of your stupid cream pie, and let's say, and you send it out. What is the social obligation that rests heavily upon all your friends? They have to like it. They have to click, like it. Because otherwise, what will you conclude if they don't like it? If 17 of your classmates are following you and 16 of them like it, the 17th clearly hates you. Maybe they have a diligent mom or dad who's saying, stop liking everything, right? Stop liking everything. The world is not that kind of place. So if you just say something lame and you just put it out there, you tweet it or you put it out there and you just say something lame, and everybody you know likes it. And then you do it again, and everybody you know likes it. And not because they like it, but because they think they gotta. And you live that way for 5 years, and then you get a job, and you're having a staff meeting, and you make an observation that's lame at the staff meeting. And nobody likes it. Everybody just sits there and looks at you. And you're devastated, you're crushed, because I've been trained to be narcissistically in love with myself, because everybody I know has liked everything I've said for the last 5 years. I mean, but let's be brutally honest. Are you that much of a sage that everything you do or say has to be, try to step the game up. And don't use your smartphone to just sort of express, the fool expresses himself at once. What you want to be doing at this stage of your life is taking things in. You want to be learning things. The scripture says those who walk with the wise will be wise. The issue is not how many, for this, again, in this stage of your life, the issue is not how many followers you have. The issue is how many people you're following and whether they are teeny bopper stars or not. Okay, if you're following thoughtful observers of American culture, if you're following thoughtful news analysts, and that's part of your mix, and you read and you're collating these things, and you make sure you get a representative spread, so it's not just reinforcing what you already thought anyway, you're going to be learning things of substance. So, you can be your own editor, assembling them to your taste, but your taste ought not to be just arbitrary or capricious. It ought to be thoughtfully done. But you can assemble them. The editorial bias of all such sites can be regulated and balanced with the presence of other sites. I can drop or add depending. For example, during the heat of this last campaign, I dropped Drudge. So Drudge is a news aggregator that I would follow for breaking news and that sort of thing. And during the campaign, Drudge got a little bit too enthusiastic for my taste, waving the pom-poms for Donald Trump. And it got a little tedious, and so I thought, okay, I'll just discontinue that. And now that the election is over, I can handle checking him again from time to time. That's part of the spread that I get. And I can find out, I can ask people, who do you follow? What do you follow? What if there's a breaking news story, where do you want to hear about it from? And you can have complete control over that, and you can be connected, and whether you're connected or not, and how you're connected, is something that is up to you. Now, what has been striking to me is that a number of Republicans have been leaping to the defense of what we might call the legacy media, the 3 networks and newspapers. They've stood for years against media bias, and they've complained about that liberal bias in a whiny voice for almost the same length of time. But they draw the line at Trump calling them all out for the buffoons, poltroons, and macaroons that they are. I know, don't look it up. That's another thing, is you can, macaroon is a little circular cake, a dainty, a trifle. And actually, I think that works, right? Buffoons, poltroons, and macaroons. Moving on. If you had, again, just look at your smartphone and ask yourself, go back to, again, the era of George Washington or the era of Jonathan Edwards, the late mid-1700s, and ask yourself, how many servants would George Washington have had in order to do the things that this phone can do? So I can say, what's the Anglo-Saxon word for spider? Anybody know? Attercop. So if you know Tolkien, Attercop is what Bilbo yells at the spiders, right? Attercop. That's the Anglo-Saxon word for spider. So I can have access to pretty much any library in the world. I've got, in my pocket, I'm carrying around 100,000 servants who can look up a Latin word, who can tell me how to pronounce this word, who can, this is mind-boggling, right? So, it's not an assault on the freedom of the press if you learn how to collate your own news using wisdom, discretion, talking to people at church, talking to people in your family that you respect, You respect their wisdom and their knowledge, and you ask, where do you check? What magazines do you subscribe to? Where do you get your information? It's not blackening the reputation of a venerable institution to point out that it has ceased a long time before being a venerable institution. Mencken had something to say on this. Quote, American journalism, like the journalism of any other country, is predominantly paltry and worthless. Its pretensions are enormous, but its accomplishments are insignificant. In short, it shouldn't matter to us that Donald Trump is an unworthy messenger. I do believe that he's a flawed person, all right? So this is not a cheerleading thing at all. He is an unworthy messenger. The dinosaurs are old and decrepit, and the safari jeep has been on paved roads the whole time. Trump is going to sleep like a baby in a luxury hotel tonight, and the entire thing is completely unfair. Completely unfair. But the fact that something feels unfair doesn't keep it from happening. And this is why celebrity journalists and advocates and apologists for the old order, the order of the Industrial Revolution, the media of the Industrial Revolution, are giving way to the media of the digital revolution. And the digital revolution is just in its infancy. Okay, you need to understand that. It's just in its infancy. You've heard of Cotton Mather, have you not? Cotton Mather, Puritan father in Massachusetts, a Puritan of the colonial era. I stand, in terms of chronology, my presence in Idaho is comparable to Cotton Mather's presence in Massachusetts. Idaho just celebrated its centennial just a few years ago. We only just got here, right? We only just got here. We're barely settling in. And Cotton Mather, he's ancient history. The East Coast, they've actually got history. That's the difference between Englishmen and Americans, is that Americans think that 100 years is a long time. Englishmen think that 100 miles is a long way. Okay, we've got a geographically expansive country, but we don't have a lot of history behind us. And you have just landed on the shores of this huge continent, this continent that is going to be shaped by the digital revolution. And there's all kinds of ways of sinning with that digital technology. There's all kinds of ways of reading your Bible, spreading the gospel, learning to be wise. This is a glorious opportunity. And you want to make sure that you don't waste that opportunity. You are in a privileged position. You're in a privileged position, and you don't want to waste it. There's nobody that's going to tell you how to navigate the first 200 years of a digital revolution. I was an adult when it kicked off already. You're among the first who have grown up, who were born and who have grown up with the digital revolution underway already. All right, basically, you're the first generation of natives in this new country, in this new continent. And nobody can tell you this is how the first 200 years of it is going to go, because it's never happened before. Nobody's seen it. And this is why you have to walk by faith and not by sight. This is why you have to confess your sins as a Christian. This is why you have to worship God regularly. This is why you have to be in the Word. And this is why you have to learn to think like a Christian, so that you can take full opportunity of the technology that is going to be set in front of you, in much the same way that Martin Luther took advantage of the new printing technology that was set in front of him. So printing was invented, but it was the Protestants who first put it into active, robust, substantial use. You've got that opportunity. And it will be glorious when I'm up in heaven looking down on you guys when you're geezers to see what you've done with it. So thank you.